Hello, everyone. Tom Fox back again with Brandon Daniels, President and CEO of Exiger, for our continuing five-part series on the coming conflict with China. Perhaps I need to change that to our ongoing conflict with China. Brandon, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. It's good to speak with you again.
Brandon, one of the things I had not fully thought through was U.S. companies exporting to China for either raw materials or just basic sales. And it struck me, I was listening to a series on hobos riding the railroads, and they interviewed a railroad conductor, and he talked about the amount of lumber that is shipped to China. And it turns out that China is the biggest purchaser of US lumber. And it got me thinking, what do you do if you lose your biggest customer? And how do you think through that from a business perspective? Is I assume people all over the world need lumber, but how do you go to those new markets? Do you have to completely retrench? Do you rethink? Can you reshore your consumers? And so I just wanted to ask you and really explore that issue within the context of trade, $149 billion of US exports to China in 2021. How should we start to think through that from a, I guess, top line perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, there are a billion people in China, right? So it's an enormous market. The same is true, Tom, for soybeans. The same is true for actually the agriculture community overall. And there is a huge demand for US pork, as an example. We see the economic relationship with China being bi-directional. It's certainly imbalanced, but it is bi-directional. And like you said, what do you do if your biggest customer is no longer available? This is where the importance of balance comes in. And this is where a lot of the US officials that I work with on a day-to-day basis, this is where they're trying to determine what are the right points to negotiate, right? To structure when dealing with US Chinese relations, right? Because we believe in free and fair markets. China is a big part of our existing market. And we have to make sure that we're deterring the global community from things that are intolerable, like economic coercion and human rights abuses. But at the same time, we're recognizing that we all want to grow together. And this isn't a manufactured crisis between two countries. When I think about export controls, there are a couple of things. One, we have to determine what we are willing to do or how we're willing to manage our intellectual property, right? That's one of the biggest things is our most important inventions, right, can't be subject to threat, vulnerability, and theft. And so when we're talking about what we will buy from China, what we will sell to China, we have to recognize that there are certain industries where our most prized tooling, our most innovative concepts need to be manufactured in the United States. And we may want to restrict the flow of those technologies to China. If you look at the way that they've integrated their industrial base, right? The PRC has implemented what they call the military civil fusion strategy, and it's an attempt to merge economic, social, and security goals of the CP together. And so when we're buying and selling products like our most advanced chips or our telecommunications equipment or our most advanced software, we have to understand that they don't respect our intellectual property laws. And so we need to put extra restrictions and we need to make companies aware of the existing export control classifications that exist. The second thing is it's estimated that $2 trillion of our technology, of our goods, are counterfeit in China. They represent about 70% of the counterfeit market. And so, again, when it comes to critical technologies, being able to gain and protect our intellectual property is a key part of United States prosperity. I saw a report where CFOs were surveyed by CNBC, and this had happened back at the end of 2021. 1 in 5 corporations in the United States said that they had IP that was stolen by China. So there's a piece of this where we have to protect our IP. But then there's another piece of this where there is a manufacturing base in China and there are goods in the United States and resources in the United States that China can use in its economy. And those are commodities, right? And we have to have a robust and strong commodity market that's allowing all market participants to benefit from it. And I don't think China wants to lose us as a trade partner any more than those lumber companies want to lose China as a trade partner. But again, it comes to triaging our commerce and triaging our economics to determine where we're willing to see, like you said, a reshoring of the customer base versus where we need to see an open flow of goods.
Brandon, you mentioned some trade figures. I mentioned the $149 billion of US exports to China. Typically, in the past decade, that amount was about 20% of Chinese imports to America. I grew up and went to college in the 70s, where in economics we talked about trade deficits, and that was supposed to be a real thing. And so I was wondering if you are having conversations about trade deficits with your colleagues and perhaps even internationally. Do trade deficits even matter anymore? And the fact that China may hold paper on the US, could that lead to any economic issues that China could exploit going forward?
So one, trade deficits matter, and those key economic principles of not having these big skews. It's almost a seesaw between us and China, with our butt hitting the ground, right? We are not in a position in the global market where we make enough, right? We have to fix that. The second point on this trade imbalance is that, like you said, China holds paper on the United States, right? My biggest concern, the thing that I think creates the next catastrophic issue outside of the commercial market, which is hopefully they're going to work that thing down slowly because nobody's going in those offices and those building keys are being handed back. Outside of that, the thing that keeps me up at night is a currency crisis. It's honestly, and if you think about the way the world has worked the last 20 years, Tom, even the last 30 years, China has allowed us to borrow and then buy from them. It's if you were addicted to pizza and the pizza shop owner was your biggest lender. It's you just get deeper and deeper in the hole on pizza. But there's a bottom for them too, because at a certain point, if you're lending, if you're holding paper, if you are this invested in the United States economy, you can't disrupt that either. You need me to keep coming in and buy pizza, right? And so there's this détente that exists. There's this reality of this market imbalance where we neither of us can move an inch further than is possible. Otherwise, we throw the world into currency crisis. And that's what keeps me up at night. That's what I'm most worried about when I look out into a conflict or a potential conflict with China. Right now, we're in non-kinetic, what we call non-kinetic conflict. It's economic, it's non-kinetic in nature. If we were to move to a kinetic conflict, it would be much worse. But I'm hopeful that the world sees a view towards the United States being more independent on an energy, on a manufacturing, on a global commerce basis. The US and our allies, the Democracy 10, primarily, the sort of G7 plus 3, us all banding together and determining that we're going to work together to build better commercial relationships. And in that effort, China recognizes that their 100-year plan gets way more complex if they're not a part of that. economic balanced environment.
Let me pick up on that last point because you have talked about discussions you and Exeter have had at the national level and ongoing conversations with US businesses. But I'd like to move to that international level. Have you had conversations really internationally with Western Europe, with EU, with the G7 plus three, with groups of like-minded democratic countries to formulate a response or to at least see if there's some economic balance that we could introduce amongst ourselves that could help some of these issues?
Yeah, I have. One of the people that's on our advisory board is the Honorable Ellen Lord. She was the former Undersecretary of Defense for ANS. She maintains great relationships with our Five Eye partners. And in her conversations independently and then as an advisory board member of Exiger, she has talked a lot about this global inflection point where we all have to focus on rebalancing our trade and rebalancing the way in which we look at supply chain dependencies on ethics and transparency in our global corporate ecosystem, and to make sure that we're universally across Australia, Korea, India, the US, the way in which we're supporting each other, right? And creating new economic opportunity across one another. And, what I'm hearing is a lot of synergy. I'm due to speak in the UK at the major defense conference that they have, was invited by members of MOD to do that. We have a lot of bilateral engagement with our Australia office and with the Australian officials and defense officials. And the thing that I would say is, I think there's a broad agreement that we have to find a diplomatic path to a rebalanced global economy. And a big part of that is banding together and saying that we are going to do business with one another. We are going to be sharing the innovations that we have, whether they be in technology or they be in defense space, or they're in critical infrastructure, or they're in energy. We're going to figure out how to make this a global market and to make sure that this doesn't just become some sort of holistic retrenchment. And I hear people echoing that back to us. So I do work a lot with our Five Eye partners. And my teams work a lot with our Five Eye partners. We do work a lot with the Democracy 10. We do have a lot of conversations with our colleagues and partners in places like India and Korea and Japan. And I'm very hopeful that people see this as an ally, as a friendshoring effort, and not just a reshoring or a US shoring effort.
Well, Brendan, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode. I hope our listeners will join us next time where we take a look at some of the more nefarious activities that we have both seen China engage in terms of theft of intellectual property and other issues. I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you.